Week 3 of college football was a good reminder that if anybody thinks a week is going to be a dud or boring, they simply shouldn't listen to them because you just never know what's going to happen. We had another of games that were expected to be blowouts or not very close, but then we saw some upsets, we saw some closer games. So it's just truly another example that I don't know why you would make that statement because you don't know that this early in the season, but also college football is so unpredictable that you just never know what's going to happen. We started with a pretty entertaining start to the week. Then Thursday and Friday, we saw Memphis Tigers expect to kind of have a strong game against Navy, but that didn't turn out to be the case. It was a closer game than expected. And Memphis proved that once again, it seems like they are never prepared for the triple option. And while I understand that because of the unique nature of that triple option offense, Memphis just never looks fully prepared to face it. And granted, at the end, they did make some key plays. They created some turnovers, and that helped. You have to wonder what's going on in Memphis. Can Ryan Silverfield get this team going in a better direction? I mean, they did win the game, but there are some concerns about what this defense can do. And the offense did look a little shaky at times as well, but they do come away with the win. Maryland was off to a poor start, down 14 zip to Virginia. Virginia was playing very good to start the game, and then it was a 14-0 run, and then all of a sudden Maryland figured things out, and 42 points later, you have a 42-14 win. I thought that was pretty entertaining. The defense obviously came up huge with multiple turnovers, and that was a big part in getting this team to that victory there. The defense did its part, and then the offense took care of business when those turnovers happened. Army beat UTSA, which wasn't entirely surprising, but at the same time, it was a little bit because of what Army did against UL Monroe. The 17-13 loss was obviously disappointing. UTSA was also without Frank Harris, so it wasn't unexpected for this game to go in Army's favor, but still, you expected a close game, and that's exactly what we got. Army comes away with the win there. The morning slate was just another reminder that it's a good week, even if it's not just teams. If you're looking at matchups, if you're looking at certain positions, that's the thing where if you're saying something's going to be boring, it's only because you're looking at on a superficial level. You're not looking deep into these matchups. You're not looking deep into the players that are participating. Because even in some of the games that weren't close, there were still some really fun performances to watch. So we started, with a few teams that we expected to take care of business. Boise State took care of business against North Dakota. Their offense looked a little bit better than it had in weeks past. Ashton Genty is once again one of the best players in college football that most people probably don't know. Ohio came away with an interesting win, and I say interesting as it was 10-7. And there was a field goal that Iowa State definitely made, but was called in, it missed. And that was definitely interesting. I'm sure Iowa State fans are not happy about that, but the fact that you needed a field goal to beat a team like Ohio says a lot. We'll see what that does for the Cyclones the rest of the year. Wisconsin took a little bit of time. It was 7-7 at halftime. Took a little bit of time to pull away from Georgia Southern, but when Georgia Southern's quarterback Davis Brin throws 5 interceptions, had another fumble as well, that typically helps the other team get back on track. LSU put together one of the stronger performances in week 3. I think that Jaden Daniels finally got his footing as a passer and put together a strong performance, 425 total yards, 4 touchdowns. Malik Neighbors had an absolute monster game, 238 yards and 2 touchdowns as well. This is what we were kind of expecting from LSU. And I think that this is what we need from this offense going forward, and a strong performance from the defense as well. Now, Mississippi State, I think that we kind of expected them to take a step back. I don't think that this offense really could do much when you switch over to this kind of you have an air raid team almost going into becoming this power football team. And eventually they were going to have a game in which they struggled. It just unfortunately was against LSU, and LSU took it to them. Wake Forest was down 17-0 before coming back to win against Old Dominion. Old Dominion appears to just be have something figured out with the ACC where they can give teams a challenge or pull off the upset. But Wake Forest does come back from that. Liberty had a breakout game against Buffalo, 55 points. Caden Salter appears to be the guy. He is the quarterback, and it'll be interesting to see if Jonathan Bennett will transfer after that. But Liberty has a breakthrough game after a couple of shaky performances to start the week. Missouri had one of the most entertaining games of the morning, and this is the game where you expect people who said that it's going to be boring to kind of retract their statements because again, if you looked deep into this game, you would know that Kansas State had the opportunity to be upset. You knew that Missouri could pull off this upset. Luther Burden had a monster game. He's someone who we expected to have a breakout performance at some point or a breakout season, and so far he is doing that. Missouri also had Harrison Mavis hit a 61-yard field goal to win the game. So another exciting win for Missouri, another a little bit better than the Middle Tennessee win last week, but Missouri gets the job done, beats a top 25 team, gets us started with an entertaining win. Another entertaining win, maybe not for Florida State fans, but it was definitely entertaining for if you're a Boston College fan or just college football in general. Boston College came oh so close to stunning the Noles, a top five team, nearly went down this weekend. 31-29 win for Florida State. Boston College did everything in their power to keep this one close, but ultimately couldn't get the job done. And when you look at the box score, they kept Keon Coleman relatively in check, which was surprising. So the fact that they were able to do that and didn't come away with the win, another surprising thing. Oklahoma saw a strong performance from their offense, specifically Dylan Gabriel, who had a monster game 66-17 against Tulsa. Again, Tulsa quarterbacks, both current and former, had a rough week. The current Tulsa quarterbacks threw 5 interceptions against Oklahoma, and Davis Brin threw 5 interceptions against Wisconsin. So that's a total of 10 interceptions, a rough week for Tulsa, but Dylan Gabriel and the Oklahoma offense looked really good. Then we go to the afternoon slate. There were a number of afternoon games that were pretty entertaining, and we start with the North Carolina and Minnesota game. Now, this wasn't maybe the most entertaining game of the weekend, but this was a strong performance for a few different people that we'll go over. And it ended up with a comfortable win for North Carolina, but this game was not out of hand until late in the fourth quarter. And the biggest thing that you have to note for Minnesota is mostly the mental mistakes. When you look at the turnovers, the drops, the busted assignments, that's really where they got killed. And when we talked about it in the preview, this is a team that could hang with North Carolina as long as they played a relatively fundamentally sound football game. And for the most part, in the at least for I'd say a good chunk of the game, they did that. They were swarming to the football. Their front seven was getting good pressure. They were getting penetration against North Carolina. There were just certain plays that they let up that obviously hurt them immensely. There were a number of big plays that hurt Minnesota. There was a play in which they subbed almost everybody, or maybe they did everybody. I couldn't count because that's how many people were running in and out. And North Carolina took advantage of that because they didn't sub, so they didn't have to wait, and then there was a wide open receiver running downfield. So I think for Minnesota, the biggest thing is we've talked about coming into this year that Minnesota is maybe a team that you look at in 2024, and this was the perfect example of that. I think you saw a team that is still relatively inexperienced, a team that is learning how to play with each other, and a team that can play well. It's just that they have to show the consistency, and right now they just don't have that, but there's still an opportunity for them to grow and get better. And we saw a number of plays like that, and we saw a number of opportunities for them to improve. Drake May's health probably will be in question for a few days now. He looked like he was getting, or he got hit multiple times. He got hit pretty hard. And at one point in the first half, he was lifting his left shoulder up like he was hurt. So that's definitely something to keep an eye on. I think that his ability to make plays with his legs helped North Carolina this game. Had he not been as mobile as he was, I think that this game would have been a lot closer. North Carolina really benefited from having Drake May be able to run the football, but it also meant he took a number of big shots and he took some really, really big hits. So that is something that I'm keeping an eye on for the rest of this week to see what happens going forward. But Drake May also played a big part in this game, and we'll talk about that more in a little bit. The big plays, simply put, North Carolina made them. Minnesota did not. That was probably the biggest thing that I took away from this game. is that North Carolina was capable of hitting big plays down the field. And it helps when you have a quarterback like Drake May who can make some big throws. There were a couple of plays where Drake May makes a throw that not many quarterbacks can make. And if you're Minnesota, you kind of just have to shrug your shoulders and move on. You just can't expect anything to happen because Drake May is that good. And I don't think you have to hang your head over that. I mean, one of the first touchdowns, Drake May throws it in a perfect spot where only his guy can go get it. And even though it was good coverage, it still ended in a touchdown. There's really not much you can do about that. Again, North Carolina made those big plays. Minnesota simply did not. Minnesota made too many mistakes, and ultimately it hurt them in the end. And you simply can't do that against a team like North Carolina. The front seven for North Carolina was a matchup against Minnesota's offensive line that I talked about coming into this week of watching. That's going to be a big factor in this game, and it was. Now, the stats don't show that this front seven did a ton, but they were very disruptive. They were, I mean, Ethan Kaliakmanis was able to escape the pocket. It did not look good. So for those saying that Ethan is a good runner, he's a capable runner, but he should not be a feature point in the rushing attack. That simply should not be in the game plan. And you saw what happened is a guy who is running for his life quite a bit, and the pressure from the front seven for North Carolina played a huge role in getting them the ball back, making Minnesota uncomfortable, and that really forced their hand to be kind of one dimensional. Though they did run the ball, I think, really well at times. Darius Taylor is one of the more exciting players that we'll talk about a little bit more, but I think that North Carolina did a great job of limiting what Minnesota wanted to do, and it forced Ethan Kaliakmanis into tough spots that he simply could not escape. And when you look at what Ethan can do, I think that you're looking at a guy who is a very talented player. We just need to see more from him in terms of consistency, and he has to get a little bit more comfortable. He's 11 of 29 passing today, and I think he was cramping at times, dealing with a little bit of maybe some injuries, but so was Drake May. But Drake May obviously played a better game, still threw two picks. So I think that this is where Minnesota did some really good things in terms of making Drake May uncomfortable, providing different looks that maybe he wasn't expecting. But Drake May also made some terrible decisions today. And that was one of the interceptions. He shouldn't have thrown it at all. And it resulted in an interception for Minnesota. It kept them in the game. And then we saw Drake May also make a number of throws where you're just like, yep, that's the difference in this game is that our quarterback can't make these throws and their quarterback can. And that's kind of what we saw. And it's not all on Ethan. I think that the lack of protection against that front seven was a big factor in that. And I think that Ethan is still a very good quarterback. I think that he'll be very fun to watch. It's just that you have to have a whole team effort, and Minnesota's not one of those teams that can rely on one player to make plays. They have to rely on everyone. Now, they did have some solid performances from individuals, but again, those individuals aren't going to win you that football game. North Carolina had some individuals that you could maybe see win you a football game. Drake May is definitely one of them. Nate McCollum had a big game in his return, 165 yards and one touchdown. He had a couple big plays for the Tar Heels offense. We already mentioned Darius Taylor from Minnesota. We'll talk about him more later this week. He's one of those players that you need to get to know him if you don't already. I know a lot of people don't pay attention to Minnesota football, but Darius Taylor is probably going to continue that tradition for Minnesota of 1,000-yard rushers. He was one of the most patient running backs I've ever seen, and he's a freshman. So he's probably one of the most patient freshmen that has ever played college football. Most freshmen probably just want to get downhill. They want to make a play, and they simply don't have the patience to let things open up. Darius Taylor almost waits, I don't want to say too long, but he waits quite a bit longer than a lot of freshmen to be able to find an opening, let the play develop in front of him. And that's really exciting if you're a Minnesota fan. Jack Henderson had a solid game, 11 tackles, one tackle for loss, one pass defended, one interception, cramped up about halfway through the game, but still had the ability to come back and make some plays. Power Eccles, same thing for North Carolina. I think this game overall, even though the score doesn't indicate that, was pretty entertaining. It was back and forth, two teams really trying to figure some things out. There were some mistakes made on both sides, but North Carolina comes away with the win. And Minnesota still has a lot to be excited about for the future. Maybe they aren't as competitive as they'd like to be, but this is still a team that has a lot of bright spots, a team that has a lot to look forward to. And this is a team that will figure out how to get the job done. And they'll be playing better towards the end of the year. They're a team that usually figures out how to build off of their momentum and learn from their mistakes. And they had some good things happen this game. They also had some bad things. And it's just a matter of figuring out how to learn from those and then move on. For a little while, it felt like Georgia was in trouble, and that was kind of the case for most of the game until the second half started. South Carolina jumped on Georgia early, and that was probably the biggest thing here. And it was a game of two halves, really. You look at the first half, South Carolina was up, and they were playing with a ton of confidence. They were playing really well, and then it was like two different teams came out for both sides in the second half. I think that the 14-3 start was really good for South Carolina. That was really good to see if you're a South Carolina fan. I think that the front seven for South Carolina played really well. They took it to Georgia's offensive line. Tonka Hemingway, again, there were a lot of matchups that I talked about coming into this week that played out to be really important, and guys played really well. Tonka Hemingway is one of those guys. He was disruptive. He could have had a number of other plays that he could have made, but either he was getting double teamed or just missed on that play. He had a good game, and that's really what helped South Carolina stick around in this game. The first two drives of the second half essentially just was the difference. Georgia came out and put up 14 points, and South Carolina did not look very good. So that was the biggest thing that changed was Georgia looked like a completely different team in the second half, and South Carolina just couldn't recover. And if you've heard Kirby Smart's speeches before, then you have definitely heard the type of motivation that you'll get, and you will definitely see a different team after that. And this is a team that gets motivated by what Smart says, and this is a team that definitely knows how to pick it up and almost like flip the switch to be able to get it to a different level. Now, one thing that did help their case was Juice Wells got hurt and didn't play. And on his the first touchdown for South Carolina, he made a phenomenal play and broke a couple tackles, found himself in the end zone. He also got hurt on that play, and that and I don't want to say that that was the difference in the game, but that definitely hurt. That was really a tough one to stomach if you're a South Carolina fan, and it affected this team, especially in the second half. When you look at the quarterback play, and we'll talk about this more in depth here, Spencer Rattler looked decent. I think that there were at times in the first half where he looked really comfortable. He looked like he was making a number of plays, but then you also saw some sometimes where he didn't have time to throw. He didn't have receivers drop passes, those kinds of things. At one point, and actually, I think for the game, he was the leading passer and the leading rusher. The rushing attack simply couldn't get anything going. And the only time they felt like they were effective is when Spencer Rattler was scrambling to pick up yards. So that didn't help. That's definitely something that they'll try to address going forward. But I think that Georgia is just that good. You have to play your A game, and sometimes your A game isn't even enough. And Georgia definitely flipped the switch in the second half, and that affected Rattler probably more than anyone. Rattler finished 22 of 42 for 256 yards, a touchdown, and two picks. First half, Spencer Rattler looked really good. The second half, Spencer Rattler never really got going, and not all of that is his fault. And then when you look on the other side, I think the one thing, if you're a Georgia fan, is you need to figure out if Carson Beck can lead you to wins. Yes, there is a ton of talent on both sides. Yes, there is a lot to utilize if you're a Georgia Bulldog fan, but your quarterback play has to get better. At times, Carson Beck did not look good in the first half. He looked very uncomfortable, and that is a testament to that front seven of South Carolina. South Carolina, like I said, did a good job up front, especially early on. And they did what they could, but in the end, Georgia was just too much. And Carson Beck just needs to, I think, step up in a way. And this was his first real test. He never really faced any quality competition because he's always coming in garbage time and never really had to worry about anything in terms of making big plays where the game was actually on the line. So now you get your first taste of that. You get to see what it's like to play against a decent competitor instead of the first two teams in UT Martin and Ball State. So now you get a taste of what that's like. You get an opportunity to make some adjustments, and we'll see what happens for the rest of the season. But I think that Beck didn't really have to do much, and that allowed him to be comfortable and then make some plays later on. There are a number of other players that made plays for both South Carolina and Georgia. I think the one player that, even though he's not on this list, I think Brock Bowers showed that he is an absolute unit. There were a couple plays where South Carolina went for kill shots and they tried to knock him out, and he just barely flinched. He didn't, it almost was like he didn't even get hit. He just moved so little that it almost just made you seem like what just happened. That's how strong he is. That has how balanced he is. And South Carolina tried to send a message, but it kind of backfired. And that's this again. Brock Bowers did not have the best game, but he definitely showed that he has a special skill set that will be playing on Sundays next year. The defense for Georgia plays a different breed of defense. They were thumping everybody. Their hits appear to be harder, and you saw that on a number of plays. Kamari Lassiter had a big game, 4 tackles, 2.5 tackles for loss, 2 passes defended. He had a number of hits where you definitely heard them or felt them when you watched them. Jamon Dumas Johnson was pretty much everywhere on the field. He had a big game. Dejan Edwards had a solid performance for this rushing attack. This is a rushing attack that everyone wanted to see take a step forward. And I think that we saw that a little bit today. Still could expect a little bit more, especially against that front seven against South Carolina. Showed that maybe there is a little bit of concern. And if you're on South Carolina, you see that there is potential there. I think that there's potential to be a solid unit up front, and that could help them against other teams. It just didn't help them against Georgia. Juice Wells obviously deserves to be mentioned because of that play, the touchdown, but obviously his injury really hurt. Debo Williams had a solid game at defense for South Carolina as well, but again, just not enough to get that to work. And I think that this was still a strong performance in the first half for South Carolina. And overall, a good thing to build on if you're South Carolina. The fact that you didn't lose by nearly as much. This game was close for most of the game. So the fact that you were in this game up until the end says a lot about maybe your future and what you'd expect for the rest of the season. Is the Alabama dynasty over? It was a struggling performance for the Crimson Tide in Tampa this weekend. And there were certain factors that went into that, which we'll discuss. But it's time to ask the question of whether or not this is the end for Saban and what we used to know of the Alabama Crimson Tide. Now, I'm not saying that this is going to be suddenly a bad team, but this does not appear to be the dominant team. And I emphasize team as it once was. When you look at this team and what they did today, USF should never be in the same breath as Alabama. And granted, the weather definitely played a factor in that. It was pouring rain, but I think that there are some concerns if you're Alabama that you probably want to address, and it maybe has long-term implications and could, tell us what we need to know about this program and how much they'll be competitive going forward. The first thing is the quarterback struggles, and there's a lot to talk about with this one. Tyler Buckner took over as the starter, and I think that was an overreaction. Talk about more of that in a little bit. Tyler Buckner did not perform well. Then they go to Ty Simpson in the second half. They combined to go 10 of 24 for 107 yards. And the biggest thing I think I have to note is that when they made a mistake, they looked very both of them. Both of them did not look very confident in what they were doing. Both of them almost just didn't want to make a mistake. They were doing just enough to not screw up. And yes, everybody was struggling on the offense. The offensive line, we'll talk about in a little bit too, did not help much at all. And that's where having a runner at quarterback is helpful. The one thing that, yes, Jalen Milroe can run, and Jalen Milroe would be a solid option because of that at quarterback. But the thing that I'm just absolutely shocked that they did not give him a chance is last week against Texas, which, by the way, if you struggle against a team like Texas, that fine, but you don't deserve to get benched because of that. Were some of the throws Jalen Miller made last week bad? Yes. The two interceptions were really bad decisions. You just can't make those decisions. But the one thing that Jalen Milroe did that Buckner and Simpson did not this week was when Jalen Milroe made a mistake, he made up for it the next play. His second interception against Texas, he followed that up with an absolute beautiful ball that went for a touchdown. So in a game in which you're struggling and everybody is tensing up and no one wants to try and make a play because they don't want to make a mistake, Jalen Milroe should have been the answer. That's really what it should have been. You should have put Jalen Milroe in the second that Tyler Buckner struggled. And when Ty Simpson wasn't getting the job done, he made a couple nice throws, but Jalen Milroe should have been in there because this is not a game that you should win 17-3. I don't care if the weather's bad. I don't care any of that. Alabama is not in the same sentence as USF like they showed they were today. Now, USF had nothing to lose. They played like they had nothing to lose, and they played with a ton of confidence. And they're in this game for 4 quarters. You saw the energy in which they were playing. You saw the confidence in the plays they were making. And they, like I said, had nothing to lose. They were letting it all hang out. They were playing like there was nothing else they had to worry about. They gave Alabama everything they could and then some. And yeah, they ended up losing the game, but this is still a team that deserves a lot of love and a lot of recognition for what they did. Getting after Alabama's offensive line was probably the best thing that they did. 8 tackles for loss, 5 sacks. Alabama's offensive line looked horrible, and that didn't help the quarterback situation. But this is an offensive line that features two players that are 6'5", 6'6", and 350 pounds. Now, granted, just size alone is obviously not going to help you move people around, but you have to. You're 4 and 5 star kids going against USF, who probably has 3 star kids going against you. But that didn't matter to USF. USF found a way to make a number of big plays. Daquan Evans had a monster game. And Daquan Evans is not someone who should be getting after the quarterback, but he was a nightmare for this offensive line. And to me, the offensive line play is the bigger problem. The quarterback play obviously gets under the spotlight more, but the fact that they didn't have time to throw a lot and the fact that Buckner and Simpson got drilled a bunch of times says more about the offensive line than it says about them. And yeah, you're going to kill confidence if you're letting your quarterback get hit that much. Now, on the other side, Byron Brown did not have the best statistical game, but he made a number of plays that were really exciting and made you go, which team is he playing for? This is a guy who made something out of nothing a couple of times. 87 yards passing, not great. 92 yards rushing is a decent game, especially against Alabama. This guy played with a ton of confidence. He showed that he could be one of the more entertaining players in the NFC this year. And I don't know if USF will compete for the AAC championship, but this is definitely a team that is playing with a lot more confidence and deserves a lot more love than they're getting. And that's really exciting if you're a Bulls fan. That's really exciting if you're a USF fan that's been dying for some success. And even though you lose 17-3, the fact that you hung around with the 10th best team in the country says a lot. If you're an Alabama fan, you really have to question where this program is going. Because even in the past, when you look at what Alabama's done, their losses came to teams that were on their level in terms of or close to the level in terms of talent, and then they just had a better game. It wasn't inferior competition making things interesting. Now, yes, you can make the excuse that the weather played a factor, but Alabama should still absolutely maul USF every single time they play. And that was not the case. It doesn't matter the quarterback situation. That comes down to simply doing work in the trenches. Now, the defense did step up when they needed the most. They also only gave up 3 points. So it wasn't like they were getting torched. But this doesn't feel like the Alabama teams of old. This doesn't feel like the dynasty teams that we once had. It feels like we're in another year in which it's going to be a long year for Alabama fans and one that probably doesn't end in an SEC championship appearance. I don't think that you're going to see Alabama thrive as much as they used to. And that's really kind of sad in a way because there's a lot of talented players. I mean, Dallas Turner is still a really solid player. Roydell Williams stepped up today. Chris Braswell was really fun, but it just doesn't feel like it's the same. The mental mistakes killed them. There were a number of plays where you just had to almost bang your head against the wall if you're Nick Saban, because what else can you do? There's not much that you can do. There's not much else that you can say. And that's really unfortunate. That's really tough if you're an Alabama fan. It's really disappointing to see because this is a program that would take care of business early and often in games like this. They would not waste much time getting after this team that they'd face. And it's unfortunate that they're in this situation. And I know Nick Saban's probably just as disappointed, if not more, than anybody else. I don't know what the solution is. This is a team with too much talent to be able to play this way. A team that simply should not be playing to the level of USF. And USF, hats off to them. They played a phenomenal game. They had a great game plan. And obviously, they just couldn't get it done in the end, but it was still really fun to watch. So I don't know. Let me know what you guys think. Is the Alabama dynasty over? Have we seen the beginning of the end for Nick Saban, sending him into retirement? And what does this mean for Alabama going forward? Yes, it's just 1 week. We're only in week 3. But the fact that you lose to Texas and then follow it up with an absolute dud of a performance says that something's changing, something needs to be fixed. And I just don't know if that's going to happen. Games that wrapped up for the afternoon slate and then a little bit into the night slate before we break down a couple games. Duke, King of the Nerds, 38-14 win over Northwestern. Riley Leonard had a solid game. Ohio State took care of business against Western Kentucky, even if it took them a little bit to get going. Trevion Henderson made a nice return to the spotlight. Marvin Harrison Jr. also had a good game. Ohio State, like I said, took care of business, looked pretty good offensively. And then we go to Toledo having like I said before, this was going to be an entertaining game. Toledo and San Jose State. What was it going to look like? How could Toledo hang if this San Jose State defense, who a lot of people were sleeping on, they made life difficult. But DeQuan Finn was a factor, 154 total yards, 2 touchdowns, played a big role in this game. That was really fun to watch. James Madison barely squeaks out a win over Troy, 16-14. The Dukes hold the Trojans to negative 12 yards rushing. James Madison, and I'll look into this more as in the future, but James Madison right now might be the best group of 5 team in the country. After beating Virginia, a little bit of a disappointing performance, but you knew it was going to be close because it's a rivalry game in this conference. You're going to see 2 teams that play decent defense. James Madison is one of the better defenses in college football, and they do find a way to get to the top. And James Madison is on a mission this year. James Madison is not eligible for postseason play, and they're making life difficult for everybody that they face. South Alabama with an absolute stunner this weekend, 33-7 over Oklahoma State. The fact that Oklahoma State was not able to move the ball and get points on the board for a while against South Alabama says more about where Oklahoma State is than South Alabama, but South Alabama, after the disappointing loss to Tulane at the beginning of the year, they're looking to bounce back. And what a great way to do that right here. Florida with an absolute stunner at home against Tennessee. Tennessee still has not won at the Swamp since 2003. 29-16 for Tennessee. And I think the biggest thing is what we talked about in the preview. I talked about this when I previewed this game. Trevor Etienne and Montrell Johnson had to be a factor. Find unique ways and creative ways to get them the football, and Florida did just that. Trevor Etienne had 172 yards rushing, 1 touchdown. They also got them the ball. He and Johnson got the ball in the passing game in unique ways, whether they slipped out of the backfield, screen passes. You have to commend what Billy Napier did to get them involved. And obviously, that was a factor. Now, keeping Joe Milton in check proved to be a little bit easier than we expected. But the fact that that offense was able to get them, their playmakers in space and able to get them unique touches, that's probably the biggest thing for me. And that's what played a big role in getting Florida the win. A few games in the night slate, Ole Miss took care of business against Georgia Tech. I think some people, including myself, thought there could be an upset potential with Georgia Tech if Ole Miss did not take them seriously. Ole Miss took them very seriously, and it was a 48-23 win. Not really much to be concerned about there. BYU, I think we have to learn to stop doubting Kalani Sitake. I think that he is one of the better coaches in college football, and now BYU finds themselves at 3-0 after a 38-31 win. A 17-0 run to end the game. They were down by 10, and they find a way to win by 7. I think that this group is a tough group once again, and that's really exciting for BYU going into the Big 12. I think a lot of people had some doubts about what this team could do, especially defensively. Maybe not the best game defensively, but at the end of the day, they made the plays when it counted, especially at the end when Arkansas was driving. A fun win for BYU, and the Cougars are still undefeated heading into Big 12 play soon. West Virginia and Pitt obviously play in the backyard brawl, and what a brawl it was, and not in the most entertaining way. 17-6. Its offense looked horrible. West Virginia didn't have the best game in itself, but they played better than Pitt. So 17-6 win, not as entertaining as it was in last year's game, but still a good win for West Virginia. Texas was an interesting game against Wyoming until they pulled away late, 31-10. That margin of victory seems bigger than it should have been. Sacramento State 30-23 over Stanford. Why is that important? Because Troy Taylor, the former Sacramento State coach, went to Stanford to take over the Cardinal program. His former team comes in to Palo Alto and finds a way to win. I always love seeing a team beat their former coach who left them. 448 yards of offense, and their defense was also disruptive. Great game for Sacramento State and a fun upset in week 3. Colorado State gave us a fitting end to week 3, an entertaining end, and arguably the game of the year. These two teams did not like each other, and it was definitely chippy early on, and it ended in one of the greater games of the season so far. Game of the year, Colorado and Colorado State did not disappoint. And for two teams that want to combine 4 games last year, this was a perfect way to finish week 3. And when you look at so many things happened in this game, the first thing we'll talk about is the Travis Hunter injury. Now, the argument and the debate right now will be whether or not it was a cheap shot. And for those on the Colorado side, they'll definitely say it's a cheap shot. And I tend to agree with that side. A very late hit on Travis Hunter on a route that really the ball was out of play. The game play was over and he gets smacked. And then we find out after halftime that he goes to the hospital. That was unfortunate, and it's going to be talked about for a while now. But overall, I think that it didn't affect the game enough where you can make the argument that it was something that changed Colorado's fortune. Now, it definitely affected them, but it was still something that ended up not really affecting them too much because they win the game. It was a chippy first quarter, and we kind of expected that with the comments made by both coaches coming into the game, it being a rivalry game. Colorado State had 8 penalties in the first quarter, and penalties came back to haunt them. We'll talk about that later. Colorado had 4. These two teams do not like each other. They went back and forth with some personal foul penalties, lots of trash talk, definitely some cheap shots on both sides. But still, it was the energy that I think we needed. We've seen a lot of exciting games, but this one felt different. This one felt that it had another energy to it, another level of trash talk, another level of passion. And the fact that College Game Day was there, Big Noon Kickoff was there, so many celebrities were there as well. It made it so much better. And like I said, game of the year. All the elements that you'd want in an entertaining game were there. You had a rivalry game. You had the two big noon kickoff college game day. You had the trash talking before the game. You had trash talking in pregame warmups. You had trash talking during the game. You had back and forth battles between two quarterbacks that were super entertaining. You had quality play. You had big play after big play. And then you had overtime. This is literally everything you want in a big game and an entertaining game, and did not disappoint. Both quarterbacks were really good. Shedeur kept doing what he did, but Braden Fowler Nicolosi was probably the surprise of this game. And we'll talk more about Shedeur a little bit too, but Fowler Nicolosi made a number of key plays, a lot of smart decisions, and most of his throws, yes, were definitely the shallow crossing routes, but it was what was working. And you don't just change things because you get bored of it. You're going to keep going back to what was working. And even though they weren't a ton of yards downfield, it made a big difference between Colorado State's success versus their struggles. Now we did mention the penalties. The penalties really is what killed them. That's really what did them in. And at the end of the game, Mohamed Kamara's two penalties were just brutal. They were tough ones to take because I think if you don't get that targeting call, if you don't hit Shooter, then maybe you're looking at a different outcome. We don't know for sure, but feel like that's just the story of the game for Colorado State. In the end, they just made one too many mistakes and one too many penalties that cost them the game. And that's really unfortunate because they were playing really well and they bounced back from. I think the biggest thing was Braden Fowler Nicolosi bounced back from a pick six. This is also after he nearly threw another pick six the play before. He got called back or excuse me, an interception, and then he throws a pick six, bounces back, and then that drive was really impressive. It was a drive in which he threw it an absolute gem of a ball, and then Torrey Horton follows it up with a wide receiver pass for a touchdown to Dallin Holker. And honestly, this team did not back down, and that was the best part about this game. You knew that they were the underdog. You knew that everyone expected them to lose, but it didn't affect their game. They continued to compete, they continued to fight, and they went all the way down to the wire before ultimately falling. 367 yards, three touchdowns, two interceptions. Obviously not great, but it was a good game overall for Fowler Nicolosi, a good game for him. And you have a lot to build on for Colorado State going forward, and you're going to need that. Both teams playing conferences that appear to be really entertaining and really deep. So that is definitely something that will help is having good quarterback play. Shedeur was kind of quiet early on, just kind of doing his thing. He did throw an interception, and I think a lot of people had concerns about that. But honestly, it was one of those you just kind of waited for him to get going. And I think we're going to give Shedeur a lot of love. 348 yards and four touchdowns, a beautiful last drive in the fourth quarter, and then two great drives in overtime. Shedeur deserves a lot of love, but don't forget about Sean Lewis either. Sean Lewis grew up some great plays. He drew up the right plays at the right time, and especially in overtime, that was all Sean Lewis. Shedeur obviously had to make the throws, but Sean Lewis did most of the work there. So you have to give Sean Lewis a lot of love too. Shedeur and Sean Lewis are one of the best combinations in college football, and the Pac-12's offenses are absolutely loaded. You look at Shedeur Sanders, Caleb Williams, Bo Nix, Michael Penix Jr., Ham Ward. You are absolutely stacked when it comes to the quarterback position in the Pac-12, and that's really exciting for that conference. It's just a shame that that conference is going away because right now they're playing incredible football. They are playing at a high level, and they've provided us with some of the most entertaining games in college football this year, and that will continue, especially with Colorado facing Oregon next week. That is going to be an absolute monster of a game. It'll be super entertaining, and the result could tell us a lot about where both programs are going. There's a number of players that you could highlight here. Colorado State's secondary was playing lights out early on. They were playing with a chip on their shoulder. Had that cheap shot earlier, obviously, too, but they were playing with a ton of energy. And sometimes some of those hits that are questionable or going to get you penalties will come up. But you would rather see a team play with confidence and play with good energy than to just be tentative and let a team like Colorado run all over them. This secondary I talked about a lot in the offseason coming into this game. I thought this was going to be a good group, and they proved to be that early on. The wide receivers for them, for Colorado State, really shine. And Torrey Horton deserves a ton of love. He was the best wide receiver in this game for both teams. Colorado had no answer for him. They could not stop him. They could not tackle him. The only way at times that they tackled him was him going down by himself. He made it. I mean, had a number of missed tackles, a number of short catches that he turned into extra yards. Yards after catch were his biggest thing. And this was a passing attack that was really fun to watch. Lewis Brown was good. Dallin Holker had 109 yards and two touchdowns. This passing attack was really fun. And for a Jay Norvell team, we expected Colorado State to get better under Jay Norvell, and now we're seeing that. Yes, they are 0-2, but this is a much better 0-2 team than you might expect. They are fun to watch. They're playing with a ton of confidence. Their offense is going to move the ball against a lot of teams this year. And yes, you have to just clean up certain things. You have to clean up the penalties. The defense has to find a way to get stops in key moments, but you have things to build on, and there's a lot of exciting things going forward. Shiloh Sanders had to pick six. That was really fun to see early on. The Sanders brothers were kind of the highlights so far. It would have been interesting to see what this game would have looked like if Travis Hunter was still around, because I think Colorado State definitely took advantage of Travis Hunter not being there, and they knew exactly what to do. And that's okay. Hopefully Travis Hunter is all right, but you got allowed other players like Xavier Wheeler. You also allowed Jimmy Horn. Jimmy Horn had a really interesting game. He didn't really do a ton during the early parts of the game. On the last drive, he also had a procedural penalty that was obviously hurting that team. And then he has the big touchdown to potentially tie it up and then get the 2-point conversion. Jimmy Horn had a good performance down the stretch. Xavier Weaver was solid. This is a team that continues to find weapons, and I wish they could find a rushing attack because that makes it even more terrifying. But ultimately, this was the Shooter Sanders show. This was his ability to keep doing what he does best, which is shine in the spotlight, continue to allow his team to make plays, and trust his coordinator in Sean Lewis to make plays. Once again, game of the year already, a back and forth game between two rivals. This is exactly what college football is about. This is exactly why we love this sport. Two teams. I think the best thing about two is it was kind of a breath of fresh air. You haven't seen these two teams in the spotlight in a long time, especially Colorado. Colorado State's been kind of up and down, but never in the spotlight, especially not the national spotlight. So for college game day to show up, for big new kickoff to show up, all these shows to show up, and then to be in the national spotlight, and then to have a game like this, both of these teams are going to be really exciting going forward, and both of these teams have a lot to be excited about for the rest of 2023.